Part three is that the Army of the Potomac, again, technically under Meade, but really under Grant, is going to attack Lee's army. He's going to force him back toward Richmond and prevent him from reinforcing Joe Johnston in Atlanta. Part four, our old friend, good old Benjamin Butler. He's now on the peninsula. Remember the peninsula in Virginia where McClellan completely screwed up?
Who could forget?
Yeah, absolutely a fiasco of a campaign. But Butler's down there now. His job is to march up toward Richmond from the southeast so that Richmond would be kind of caught in a pincher movement, being hit from the southeast as well as from the north. And then the fifth part of this plan was that Franz Sigel, German American, he had an army of 6,500 in West Virginia. They would march into the Shenandoah Valley, commandeer its resources, and disrupt communications with the Valley and Lee's army. And people asked Lincoln about this strategy. They thought, well, this is kind of weird. Why do you want to have this? Is so complicated. Why are we doing this? And Lincoln said, in his inimitable way, he says, those not skinning can hold a leg. In other words, in the East, Grant was going to do the skinning, and Butler and Sigel were going to hold a leg, meaning they're going to tie down other parts of the Confederate Army so that they can't help out Robert E. Lee. All right, so General Banks, the plan is to go to Mobile, but actually Lincoln overrides, and General Halleck is a part of this too. Instead of going to Mobile, he moves the opposite direction. He goes up the Red River in an attempt to invade Texas. And as we know by now, when you try to attack and invade Texas, it always fails, right, Scott?
It's like trying to declare a land war on Asia or occupy Russia or Afghanistan. It's not going to work.
Never get involved in a land war in Texas. But so Banks fails. And it's honestly, Banks didn't even want to do that. Banks wanted to attack Mobile, and Grant wanted him to, but Lincoln overruled. And then we'll talk about Benjamin Butler and Franz Sigel in a future episode. I don't want to get too deep into what's happening in the West. We'll do that in the near future. But for now, let's focus on Sherman's campaign on Atlanta. How does that sound?
Well, that sounds good, but it's always good to dig into the background of these people, of these Civil War generals, because some of them are military men. Some of them are, I wouldn't say hucksters, but they have a very strange background. They have some involvement in the military, then they become haberdashers, or they try to start a business, or they're bankers, or they're professors, or they're Episcopalian bishops.
That's always great training.
Yeah, I mean, or classics professors. What about Sherman? What was he? Was he an Ottoman historian, which I'd like to think?
Do you have military ambitions, Scott?
Just seeing.
Well, let's see. Sherman he was a West Pointer, like nearly all of the major commanders on both sides. But when he graduated from West Point, he went into the Army as a young officer. He did not fight in the Mexican War. That sets him apart from a lot of the major generals in the Civil War. He actually served in an administrative position in California. So he didn't see the combat down in Mexico that other generals like Lee and Grant and even people like Braxton Bragg, Stonewall Jackson, people like that. He, like a lot of people, this is a common theme that we've seen before. We're going to talk about it some more too. In the 1850s, he left the Army because it was just so hard to get promoted. The Army was so small. They just didn't have a lot to do other than fight the occasional Indian tribe. And the pay was horrible. So he left the Army. He tried banking, and that failed. But then he got a job in Louisiana, of all places. That's kind of an ironic thing that a lot of people don't realize. This man who would become the scourge of the South actually worked in the South right up until the Civil War. He was the head of the Louisiana Military Academy, which later became a fine institution that we know of now as Louisiana State University. And when he was down there, serving as the head of this military academy, we've talked about that too, haven't we, Scott? How there's so many independent military academies in the South because the culture was so martial. You have VMI, you have the Citadel, you have other ones, which you really don't have a lot of that in the North. But anyway, I'm getting off track. Sherman, when the war broke out, of course, Sherman was a patriotic Northerner. He was from Ohio, so he resigned his position as head of the Louisiana Military Academy and went into the Army, and he became a general pretty quickly. Sherman was actually, I don't think we talked about this when we talked about Kentucky a long time ago, but Sherman was the first Union commander over all Union forces in Kentucky, but he actually had kind of a mental breakdown. He was prone to depression and anxiety, and he had a what we would today call a nervous breakdown, and he was relieved of command. But thanks in part to General Grant, he was brought back into the service and restored to the position of general. And Grant and Sherman had a great relationship, and we could talk a long time about this. Entire books have been written about this, but it's one of the greatest military friendships in American history. Grant and Sherman, they knew each other, they trusted each other, they understood how each other thought. One time Sherman said that he stood by me when I was crazy, and I stood by him when he was drunk. So they stood together through thick and thin, and really, I think that relationship is a large part of why the North eventually is going to win. It's not the only reason, of course, but it's certainly part of it. We don't really see a lot of that in the South. We've talked a lot about bickering among the different generals and how they couldn't get along. Lee had a great relationship with Jackson, but it wasn't close personally like Sherman's and Grant's relationship was. And of course, Jackson was killed fairly early in the war, about halfway through. So anyway, Grant and Sherman said to Grant, and we're going to have a lot of Sherman quotes. Sherman is fantastic. He is a gold mine for pithy, witty quotes. But this one's not really witty, but this sums up the strategy that Grant and Sherman are going to adopt. And Sherman says, we cannot change the hearts of the people in the South, but we can make war so terrible that they will realize its folly. And again, that's the strategy of exhaustion. We have to, I don't know, I hate to use a cliche, but if you're going to make an omelet, you got to break some eggs, right? If you want to bring the war to a rapid conclusion, you've got to make it horrible.
Sort of like the Red Army invading former Axis territories at the end of World War II.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think a lot of that was revenge, though. I think there's a little bit different, but a similar approach to warfare. So Sherman takes command at Chattanooga, and he is given command of what we would call an army group today. That term's used a lot in World War II, but they did not use it in the Civil War. But Sherman is the overall commander of 3 individual armies, each with their own commander. And this is the dream team. I tell you, Scott, this is probably the most talented army in terms of its overall commanders. Sherman, of course, is terrific, and he's got 3 army commanders, all of whom are top-notch. So let me break them down real quick. We have the Army of the Cumberland under George Thomas. We've talked about George Thomas before. He had 60,000 men. He was the Rock of Chickamauga. We had the Army of the Tennessee under James B. McPherson, and he's kind of a new person. We haven't mentioned his name. We talked in a previous episode about how the Union had the cream rising to the top. You remember that?
Oh, yeah.
The Union is really good about developing talent. Kind of like the Houston Astros, but although lately as of the time of this recording, they've been slumping lately. But the Union, I don't know, they had a great farm team, let's say, and as their top commanders fell away for one reason or another, these other guys rose up through the ranks and really did a terrific job. So McPherson, he's got 25,000 men, and then you had the Army of the Ohio under John Schofield, and he's another one I don't believe we mentioned before. He had 15,000. So the total force is about 100,000 men. It's a huge army. And they are facing off against the Confederate Army of Tennessee, which had about 65,000, and they stood between Sherman and Atlanta. So they're north of Atlanta, south of Chattanooga. They're commanded, of course, as we've said before, by Joseph Johnston. And Johnston's corps commanders were not quite as good as the Union ones. He had a fellow named William Hardee, Hardee. Then you had John Bell Hood, who is a very gifted division commander and a brigade commander. Hood is very aggressive. And then you had our old buddy, Bishop Leonidas Polk, who is not good at all. And he gets reinforcements, so the army grows to 80,000. So to summarize, we've got 100,000 Union against 80,000 Confederate, and I would give the edge in command definitely to the Union in this case. Throughout May, Sherman repeatedly tried to turn Johnston's flank, the old traditional turning of the flank, and it works. Johnston keeps having to retreat. He keeps having to move back further south to Atlanta. The Federals did lose an opportunity to seriously damage the Confederates at Resaca, Georgia, due to McPherson moving too slowly and cautiously. McPherson is kind of new to Army command, and he's a little bit slow. He's going to grow out of that. But Sherman said to him, he said, "Mac, you missed the opportunity of a lifetime."
Yeah, and I just want to mention a little bit here because some Civil War historians think that things could have wrapped up much more quickly if the Union would have exploited some advantages, especially with some intelligence that George Thomas had. So let me just mention a little bit here. So going back a few months, in February of 1864, even before Grant is promoted to general-in-chief, Thomas was making some minor attacks and probing Confederate defenses, and he discovers that Snake Creek Gap, which is south of Dalton, it's basically a gap that's unguarded and it offers a way to Johnston's rear. It's a discovery that what one Civil War historian named Benson Bobrick says, if it had been properly exploited, could have saved thousands of lives in a swift, smart campaign. So if this had worked, this flanking attack would bypass Johnston's defensive position, trap his army north of Atlanta in the early stages of Sherman's Atlanta campaign. And at the very least, it would make Johnston abandon his defensive position. So Thomas is planning along these lines. He even proposes a flanking attack and a wire to Grant on February 28th. And also what it would have done is Thomas's army would have likely seized railroad and wagon bridges and cut Johnston's line of communications and supply. So later, Thomas testified before the Joint Committee of Conduct of the War, and he says, "I proposed to General Sherman that if he would use McPherson's and Schofield's armies to demonstrate on the enemy's position at Dalton, I would throw my whole force through Snake Creek Gap, which I knew to be unguarded, fall upon the enemy's communications between Dalton and Resaca, thereby turning his position completely, force him either to retreat toward the east or attack me, in which latter event I felt confident that my army was sufficiently strong to beat him. General Sherman objected to this plan for the reason that he desired my army to form the reserve of the united armies and to serve as a rallying point for the two wings." So it's easy to look at counterfactuals and say it would have definitely worked. A lot of people think that it would have worked, but hey, it just goes to show that planning something this big and with this many moving parts is messy.
Yeah, it really is, Scott. It's difficult, and it's easy for us to, in hindsight, question what these people did. I think Sherman is playing it careful here. He realizes he does have a numerical advantage. He's got 100,000 to 80,000, but that's not a ridiculous advantage, right? I mean, we've seen armies that are outnumbered by that much actually win upset victories before several times. So I think what Sherman is doing here, he realizes that he's very likely to win this campaign if he just plays it cool and doesn't screw up. It's kind of like a football team that they are ahead in the fourth quarter. What do? They run the ball every play because you don't want to go airing it out, throwing a bunch of passes that might get intercepted and run back. So there we go. I've used another football analogy. If I can't work in movies, I'll work in football.
Swing for the fences. So, yeah.
That's right.
Don't swing for the fences. Let's mix in as many sports analogies as we can.
Small ball. Okay, so Sherman's forces. Another thing he's dealing with, too, speaking of Sherman's problems that he's having to overcome, his forces are constantly harassed by Confederate cavalry under Nathan Bedford Forrest, our old friend that's always popping up and
Wizard of the Saddle,
causing migraines for Union generals. Sherman famously said, he was so mad, he said, "Forrest must be hunted down and killed if it costs 10,000 lives and bankrupts the federal treasury." Imagine Lincoln didn't agree with the bankrupt the federal treasury part of it. But anyway, so they're dealing with Forrest and other raiders that are constantly harassing, cutting supplies, stealing things, and capturing goods and even people sometimes. But Johnston is continuing to retreat. By May 25th, he had retreated to New Hope Church, which is about 35 miles north of Atlanta. There's some heavy skirmishing there. And then by the second week of June, the Union had reached Marietta. Johnston had his right flank anchored on Kennesaw Mountain, another mountain